Let me tell you a tale of two continents. One in the Atlantic, called Atlantis. Another in the Pacific, called Lemuria, or Mu, M-U for short. 25,000 years ago, these two continents were battling each other on the ideology of the day. Look at them as the two largest children on the block and the two highest civilizations. At that time, they both had two different ideas about which direction civilization should go. The Lemurians felt that the other, less evolved cultures should be left alone to continue on their own evolution scale. The Atlanteans believed that all the less evolved cultures should be brought under sway by the two evolved ones. This caused a series of wars between Atlantis and Lemuria. In these series of wars, thermonuclear devices were used. And when the wars were over and the dust cleared, in reality, there was no winner. The outback in Australia, the Mojave Desert, parts of the Gobi Desert, and the Sahara are all remains to remind man of the futility of this type of war. During the wars themselves, people, highly civilized, stooped to quite low levels. But they too, at the end, they realized the futility of such behavior. Lemuria and Atlantis itself became the victims of their own aggressions. Both the Lemurian homeland and the Atlantean homeland had been weakened by the wars. Thus, they knew that in about 15,000 years, both of their continents were going to sink completely. The Atlanteans had their second set of cataclysms, which reduced Atlantis from a large continent to a series of islands. Lemuria, in essence, did somewhat of the same. However, you might say, well, why would the people be upset at that time for something that was going to happen 15,000 years in the future? In those days, people lived for 20, 30,000 years commonly. They understood many of those who caused the havoc would see the end of the destruction. When Lemuria, which went down first, almost 200 years before Atlantis sunk, they petitioned the Agartha network. The Agartha network is a network of subterranean cities that is guided by a city called Shambhala the Lesser, to distinguish it from Shambhala the Greater, which is the etheric Shambhala over the Gobi Desert. Shambhala the Lesser was created when the continent of Hyperborea was vacated after Earth lost her mantle and the planet started receiving radioactive waves that they had not been victim to in the earlier times. So they started building subterranean cities over 100,000 years ago. When Atlantis and Lemuria petitioned to build subterranean cities themselves and to be accepted into the Agarthian network, they had to prove to Shambhala the Lesser that they had learned the lessons of aggression, that they had learned the lessons of war. And they also had to prove it to many other agencies, such as the Confederation, which we will go into a little later, because Atlantis and Lemuria had both been members of the Confederation. And when they started their warlike efforts against each other, they were expelled temporarily from the Confederation and had to prove that they had also learned the lessons of peace to be allowed to be members of the Confederation again, to be accepted into it. on Shasta, which is where the Lemurians chose to build their city. California was part of the colonies, part of the area of the Lemurian lands, and they understood that Mount Shasta and those areas of California would survive the cataclysms. Mount Shasta already being a place of great sacredness on this planet. They chose to reroute the lava tunnels from Shasta itself so that the volcano would not erupt again. And there was already a very large domed cavern within it, and they decided to build upon that. And they constructed the city that we now call Telos. Telos was the name of the whole area of much of what is now the Southwest and much of what is now California was originally called Telos, which meant communication with spirit, oneness with spirit, understanding with spirit. It was constructed to hold a maximum of 2 million people. When the cataclysms started, only 25,000 people were saved. Many had been brought to Telos before the cataclysm started. But when the second set started in Lemuria, the volcanoes started erupting so fast and sent so much debris into the air that where they had intended to try and save at least 1 million people from the Lemurian mainlands, they were only able to save 25,000. And thus, that was what was left of the Lemurian culture, the Lemurian mainland. Already the records have been brought from Lemuria to Telos. Already the temples had been built in Telos. While Lemuria, or what was left of Lemuria, mainly Telos, was coping with the aftermath of the destruction of their continent, the earthquakes continued. During these earthquakes, the earth shook so hard that in many, many places they went right off of what you would now call the Richter scale. When a continent sinks, the whole planet reacts. Earthquakes that reach the equivalent of what you would call a 15-point. These earthquakes were so intense that many people died from the sound of the earthquake, not from any effect of the quake itself, such as a building falling upon them or something. But a quake of that high of intensity created a screech through the atmosphere that killed many people simply from the sound of it. Many other places, the earthquakes were so intense that in many places where the earth was mostly clay, it liquefied and acted like a sea of mud, swallowing whole cities, whole just on the Lemurian mainland, but on many the planet. Another thing that came after that, as the continent itself went down, were so large that sometimes they went not just hundreds, but 1,000 miles inland. The equivalent of a tidal wave starting on the coast of California and completely taking out Oklahoma City. Tidal waves like that run rampant as well as the earthquakes. In many cases, and in some areas, the shaking never quit. There would be a constant swarm of, if not large ones, then small quakes. The hierarchies, the councils of this planet, understood this was going to happen. So they tried to construct both cities prior to the destruction of Lemuria itself, understanding that the Atlanteans would not get a lot of construction done under those circumstances. Also, at the same time, the Great Pyramid in Egypt was constructed underneath the tutelage of the Lemurian high priest, better known as Thoth. and the Atlantean record chambers, which were geared to hold not only Atlantis' records, but Lemuria's, Pan's, Og's, Hyperborea, all of the other cultures that have existed and reached high levels upon this planet. The Atlanteans moved into their city at just about the same time Lemuria sunk, moving in first their priesthood, their greatest scientists, some of their greatest thinkers, to try and preserve their lives against the coming cataclysms. Atlantis itself started shaking at the same time Lemuria was going down, and Atlantis continued to shake and lose parts of its land for 200 years before it too finally went completely down. For almost 2,000 years after the Atlantean and Lemurian catastrophes, the planet was still shaking. To lose two huge land masses within 200 years of each other, plus the planet was still witnessing the effects of the thermonuclear weapons that had been used in the Atlantean-Lemurian wars, plus the fact that so much debris had been thrown into the atmosphere that it never became quite bright daylight for almost 300 years after Atlantis' destruction. This caused many, many life forms, plant forms, to go extinct. Plants that were common in Atlantean times, common in Lemurian times, that no longer exist because they simply couldn't survive the long stages of filtered sunlight. Some have survived, yes, many animals and plants. The human condition in those civilizations that survived it, Egypt, Peru, Rama, better known as India. In many places, people became so frightened by the constant earth activity that civilization, even in the last bastillions, started deteriorating very, very fast. One question I have heard again and again is, well, if Atlantis and Lemuria existed, how come there's not more evidence on the surface of that? That is why. Most of the cities were shook to rubble. Those that were not shook to rubble were wiped out by the earthquakes, or wiped out by the tidal waves. Even those who survived even the tidal waves, even the earthquakes, hunger was rampant. Disease was rampant. Some areas of civilization, like those future named Egypt and such, did survive. They even kept their civilization intact. But even they started losing the highest elements of their civilization. Many, many machines quit working because of the filtered sunlight. Many, many people moved from the cities. They started feeling that living in a city was a death trap, because you never knew when a building was going to fall on you. What would look like a very strong building, have it go through 300-400 earthquakes, it's a goner. Some buildings were built to withstand it. The Great Pyramid withstood the earthquakes, but it was built with sacred geometries. Other buildings like that throughout the planet survived, but most of the cities were completely reduced to rubble. In many areas, they rebuilt the cities, but even then, each time the cities were rebuilt, it was on a slightly less, should I say, technology. Each city was a little more primitive than the city before it. The Atlanteans moved into their city, which was built underneath the Mato Grosso plateau in what is now Brazil, which had been Atlantean territories at that time. Getting an understanding of what was happening on the surface, you can perhaps understand how the Lemurians and Atlanteans would prefer to be living underground. During this time, there was an integration more and more with the Agartha network. As I explained earlier, Agartha is a confederation of several subterranean cities. As a matter of fact, there's over 120 of them. Some of them that were built in the very early times, such as Shambhala the Lesser, which is peopled with beings from Hyperborea. These are 12-foot tall beings. Being as man on this planet, as on many other planets in this solar system, was originally of a height of about 12 feet. When we lost the mantle and started reaching more and more rays from the planet, or rays from the sun to the planet, that we were not used to coping with, it caused change within our bodies. Already, by the time Lemuria and Atlantis sunk, man had gone from 12 feet to 7 feet. Thus the Atlanteans and Lemurians were around 7 feet, and still are. And, as you can see, there has still been a lowering of the height on this planet. Thus people have gone down to now, for the foremost, less than 6 feet. We have lost over a whole foot in just 10,000 years. However, that trend is starting to reverse itself, and as our spirituality is growing greater, we are slowly returning back to our original heights on this planet. Within the Agartha network, the cities that are allowed to join are only those that are based on light principles, only those that are based on love, only those that does not hurt, only those that are based on non-aggression fate. Within the Agarthian network, besides Telos, which is the capital, there are 4 more cities, for instance, that are based on Lemurian technology and Lemurian ideas. One is called Rama, which is underneath India. Rama being the original name of India. The Rama culture is consisted of people that are almost pure Lemurian before the so-called Aryan race entered India. The other 2 cities that hold an allegiance to Telos but are very independent are Uyghur cities. One is called Shonshi, which is under Tibet, not too far from the capital of Tibet. It is being sheltered from the surface by a Tibetan lamasery. This is a Uyghur city. Uyghurs are a group of people that left Lemuria 40 to 50,000 years ago and situated themselves throughout much of what is Asia, India, and Central Europe. The second Uyghur city is called Xinhua. Xinhua is in the Gobi, or should I say under the Gobi Desert. This too is a Uyghur city. On top of the Atlantean city, which is called Posidid, the one underneath the Monte Grasso Plateau, there is also another Atlantean city, just a little farther north, and there is another Atlantean city that is underneath the Atlantic Ocean, and several other smaller satellite cities throughout the planet. As I said, these are all a member of the Agartha Confederation. Plus there are several independent cities that are not a branch of any of the larger cities that have simply built subterranean to escape things that have happened on the surface. Some pre-Atlantean Lemurian disaster, some post. The city itself, Telos, as I said, is built under a dome that reaches quite a few hundred feet from floor to ceiling and spreads across most of what would be the base of Mount Shasta. Looking from the outside, the top of the dome is about halfway up the mountain. The bottom of the dome is just about even with the base of the mountain. Underneath that are 5 more levels that had been constructed. These levels take up a space so that the deepest levels are about a mile below the ground level at Shasta. The rest of the city is built on 5 levels of several square miles across. These levels are divided up by usage. The top level, being under the dome itself, is where the main part of the city is. This is where the majority of the people live. This is where the public buildings are. This is where most commerce takes place. The second level down is where manufacturing takes place. Some classes take place, and also more people live on. The third level down is totally hydroponic gardens where we grow all of our food supplies. The fourth level down is half hydroponic gardens, part nature and part manufacturing. The final level down is what we call our nature level. This is the level that is more than a mile in some spots below the ground. In this level, we have created lakes, tall trees, park-type atmospheres. This is where animals live. We have had animals underneath for so long that they have lost their aggressions. That and different temples, priests and priestesses worked, you might say, with their ancestors, removing the need of fear, since it is fear that creates aggression, not only in humans, but also in animals. Thus, we truly have the experience of lions lying down with lambs. In the nature levels, this is where people have come to relax. This is also where we have saved many animals and plants from extinction. More on side 2.